Friedrich Nietzsche and Soren Kierkegaard are often grouped together as some of the first thinkers in what would become existential philosophy. However, Nietzsche, who outlived Kierkegaard, likely never encountered Kierkegaard's work directly. The differences between them are therefore stark. Although diametrically opposed on religion, both philosophers find some common ground in making the subject the most important matter in their works. It is this similarity which leads them into comparable territory. It forces them to reconsider the metaphysical tribulations that were and still are ingrained in Western culture, critiquing and dismantling them, all in the hopes of giving the individual the philosophical focus it so deservingly needs. Nietzsche arguably does this best, since he begins by overturning basic assumptions, leaving nothing unchecked, and then works his way up to the individual and the herd. Thus, although Kierkegaard writes poetically of the self, Nietzsche truly provides existentialism with an all-encompassing critique of contemporary thought by beginning with ontology, and then moving forward in an engaging fashion. Kierkegaard does not have a strident ontology or anything but the self. For him, the self is all-encompassing and the most important of all fundamental issues. Therefore, he turns his attention towards the subjective experience of the self, and not so much on the ontology of being itself. Heidegger recognizes Kierkegaard as the first to establish the self not as a category of thought, but rather as a way of being itself. In other words, one becomes a subject of subjective autonomy rather than thinking subjectively into being. Due to this fundamental mode of thought, Kierkegaard largely keeps away from abstractions on religion, the self or society, in the same vein as Nietzsche's polemics against metaphysics. Kierkegaard was attempting to fight against the dominant Hegelian philosophy of the time, which posited that man was merely a victim of social forces, a philosophy where the individual disappears in change rather than creating the change for himself or herself. Whereas many thinkers of this time, influenced by Hegel and Kant, saw existence as a concept, Kierkegaard realized that his own existence was not a matter of speculation to him, but a reality which he was personally and passionately involved. Therefore, Kierkegaard viewed the categorization of the self as a perversion of subjectivity. Existence is not mirrored as a concept of the mind. It is self-created and self-categorized through the either-or of choice. No metaphysical abstractions will do the self justice, only the subjective choices that truly represent it. Similar to Kierkegaard, Nietzsche's concept of being is difficult to pinpoint, yet his ontology is the cornerstone of his greater ideas and is therefore necessary to understanding his positions fully. His ontology can thus best be watered down to a kind of opposition to Kantian conceptions of being. Kant considers there to be two realms of knowledge regarding an object: the phenomenon, experienced by the senses, and the noumenon, something that is thought, or the object of an act of thought. Thus Kant differentiates a thing from a thing in itself, and posits that the latter, which is the noumenon, is not fully knowable, since we can only infer from the appearances of phenomena. Kant uses noumena as a way to defend reason and metaphysics by arguing they are a necessary limitation, since they leave questions of the divine outside of its scope. For Nietzsche, Kant's distinction is a meaningless metaphysical construction. A thing in itself cannot possibly be conceived separate from its appearance, since that would undermine our entire ability to perceive at all. Noumenon is therefore identical to phenomenon. Nietzsche seems to imply that the phenomenon-noumenon distinction is not just superfluous but entirely irrelevant to the point of doing philosophy. The Greeks, he writes, knew how to live because they adored appearance, forms, tones, words, the whole Olympus of appearance. Thus Greeks were superficial out of profundity. This is a characteristic take on Aristotelian metaphysics, whereby a thing is a substance plus its attributes. Nietzsche celebrates the Greeks for their close attention to the surface, whose actual textual forms and tones and words need not be somehow subordinate to that a thing actually is itself. It is from here that Nietzsche begins to break down Western metaphysics. By eliminating the Kantian metaphysical realm of ontology, Nietzsche opens the door to possible conclusions, such as, if there is no noumenon, if appearance is all we have, then there is no objective ethics, no distinction between metaphysics and science, and no knowledge greater than us. This view of being and existence leads to subjectivity, one which Kierkegaard embraces as the only real truth. Nietzsche pushes this idea of subjectivity to its ultimate conclusion by arguing for a morality beyond good and evil, giving agency of choice and decision to the individual rather than to objective categorizations of what one ought to do. It is through his rejection of the noumenon that he affirms life, the subject and experience as the basis of philosophy itself. Questions regarding the noumenon or noumenal world for Nietzsche are useless since our living reality, the phenomenological, is the only reality we can conceive. Therefore, discussions on the ideal or greater forms are thus useless in accruing usable knowledge. Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, the reason of which this world has been categorized as apparent are the very reasons which indicate its reality. Any other kind of reality is absolutely indemonstrable. The apparent world is the only one. The true world is merely added by a lie. This is him accusing Western metaphysics of perpetuating a lie, of creating a so-called quote-unquote true world of greater forms that distorts our actual perceivable reality. Nietzsche mostly rejected metaphysics as, through the history of philosophy, institutionally illegitimate. Therefore, for Nietzsche, he believed that Western metaphysics ironically proved his argument for the will to power. Be it Kant's a priori arguments for noumena or Plato's forms, these metaphysical claims are merely descriptions of what the author wants to see in the world, all of which grants him to the power of knowledge, in the hopes of foolishly making the world more recognizable. But Kierkegaard and Nietzsche value the subject and largely reject metaphysics, which is where they intersect on the ontological front. Kierkegaard's position against universals bears resemblance to Nietzsche's position of perspectivism, that there are many different interpretations and different perspectives of a particular truth, which is the fundamental problem and concept regarding complexity. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard both place emphasis on the individual, but apply these interests differently. Nietzsche is concerned mostly with the will of the individual in social relations and is thus concerned with questions of consciousness. This is something Kierkegaard doesn't specifically cover. He begins this inquiry from his ontology. If there are no metaphysical claims beyond human capacities, all that is required is the will for it to be done. It is from here Nietzsche explores consciousness stemming from his ontological foundations. He theorizes in the gay science that consciousness has developed only under the pressure of the need for communication. Consciousness is really only a net of communication between human beings. In other words, consciousness is necessary to reconcile and communicate competing instincts, drive, desires, and passions of the will. Given all of this burden internally, without such means of communication or consciousness, man is left powerless. Our actions, thoughts, feelings, and movements enter our own consciousness. As the most endangered animal, he needed help and protection. He needed his peers. He had to learn to express his distress to make himself understood. It is here that Nietzsche's position on the self becomes clear. We are not a kind of Platonic essence, as Plato would claim. We are a product of competing drives and perspectives. It is from here that man finds himself stuck. Nietzsche describes our subconscious world as one of servant organs working in mutual cooperation and antagonism, the subconscious being the opposite of the will and that of consciousness. Thus the herd requires a kind of forgetfulness that is self-induced. Kierkegaard fails to properly discuss consciousness in the context of the crowd. He only briefly explores phenomenology in the concept of anxiety, where he argues that anxiety serves as a means for the mind to induce self-conscious reflection before a choice of either or. The lack of analysis on consciousness leaves a gap in Kierkegaard's work. He jumps into analysis of the self without fully establishing his foundations. Nietzsche's claims, on the other hand, build off each other by philosophically reaching the self from the grounding up rather than assuming certain characteristics of the self and its interaction with the world. Looking past consciousness, Nietzsche begins to dismantle the herd and its characteristics. He sees it as the opposition of the individual since it values what does not have value. The herd accepts pessimism and makes value judgments based on fear and peer approval rather than personal conviction. They take comfort in being in relation to others. For Nietzsche, the herd denies their own will, which is that which can be seen as consciousness itself. This view and analysis of the crowd or herd is very similar to Kierkegaard, where he writes that a crowd, in its very concept, is untruth, since the crowd either renders the single individual wholly repentant and irresponsible, or weakens his responsibility by making it a fraction of his decision. The crowd or the herd, therefore, dissipates responsibility among itself, acting as one unit but not taking responsibility as one. This creates a dissonance between action and accountability, which Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are correct to be wary of. So what do we do? The question of what we ought to do is difficult and is one both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche treat differently. Kierkegaard argued that the leap of faith is necessary to reach the religious state where one is in personal dialogue with God, that which is more appealing to the emotions and impulsive. It is at this level that the self is actualized and becomes fully authentic in serving a greater subjective purpose. Therefore, the religious stage is beyond living as a mere ethical individual. It suspends the universal ethical principle for a subjective realization of God's purpose. Nietzsche too suspends the universal ethical principle, but he does this differently. He does not prescribe an easy solution to our social tropes. He is only interested in removing the constraints which are both real and imagined, which prevent individuals from reaching their possible potential. He desired to bring philosophy down from divine instruction of the mere metaphysical to a more humanistic relationship, which involves the grasping of the will with both hands. Kierkegaard alternatively wishes for us to subjectively realize this divine instruction from within us rather than have it be commanded to us by others. Nietzsche's writing makes it clear that he was in pursuit for the universal realization that everyone should attend towards through affirmation of life. Kierkegaard was for this, but with strings attached, which envelopes man into an innumerable amount of paradoxes and inconsistencies. Despite Kierkegaard's push for subjectivity above all else, he still leaves man's subjectivity in the presence of God. Despite his desire to be authentic, his argument for the divine still robs the individual of pure autonomy, since he is held in the shadows of a greater power beyond himself. Nietzsche would find this to be a perversion or weighing down of man's will, being analogous to the great myth of Sisyphus. Therefore, abandoning the divine places power back into the hands of the individual. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, comment and subscribe for more content surrounding philosophy and psychology. If you're feeling even more generous, you can donate to my Patreon, where you can donate a minimum of €2. Links to my Patreon account will be in the comments section and description below. Thanks for watching.